Hello everyone, my name is Simhan. This program is about people from geoscience. Today my guest is Patrick Sullivan. He's studying his PhD in Colorado School of Mines. We'll talk about his experience in integrating sedimentology, geochemistry, and paleontology during his studies and experience. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Yasmin. I'm Patrick Sullivan, as you mentioned, and thanks so much for having me.
I would like to thank you for coming to this interview. So now you have spare time as the semester is over. Before beginning the interview, tell me about yourself briefly.
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Minnesota, which is a very cold and northern state here in the U.S. It's also where I ended up going to undergrad, but I'm actually also my mom is from Switzerland, so growing up, I'm also have a Swiss citizenship, and so I grew up going to visiting my family in the Alps quite often over in Switzerland, and so I think that's where I got an appreciation for the natural world, for landscapes and mountains, and haven't gone too far here in Colorado in terms of a difference. It looks very much like the Alps in some places. So, but yeah, I've been here at School of Mines since 2019 when I started my master's, and I'm, like you said, finishing up my PhD in the fourth and final year.
Cool. So, what are your hobbies and interests? Did you manage to find them here?
Yeah, I mean, between studying, I definitely have quite a few hobbies. I like to rock climb, hike, kind of do all the things that the mountains let you do. So going camping in the summers and skiing in the winters is really important to me. And in terms of sort of creative outlets, I love storytelling. I love playing have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons before? Yeah, so I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, currently in 3 campaigns. In fact, my campaign notes for my longest running campaign is longer than my master's thesis, something I probably shouldn't admit on camera, but
Okay.
yeah, that's sort of how I love being, and I play saxophone and piano as well. So
Cool. Yeah.
well, yeah.
So I think your research area is directly linked to your hobby and interest.
Definitely.
Could you tell me about your research area and background first?
Sure, yeah. In terms of the background, how I fell into geology, geology is actually not really a class offered in American high schools. It's often you can have an optional earth science credit. So most of my exposure to an introduction to geology was sort of a little bit in like 6th and 7th grade, although I don't remember much. And then I got thrown into a class in my first year of college. It was a historical geology class. My professor, Raymond Rogers, was one of the most dynamic and interesting speakers I've ever seen. I mean, he had such a passion for geology that even though this was a class that I hadn't signed up for, I immediately was hooked. And so I just walked up to Ray and said, "Hey, I want to be involved in whatever you're doing, whatever this research is." And for the next 3 years, while I was at my undergraduate, McAllister College, I was taken to the field in Montana. So we were out there with people from the Smithsonian that were looking for dinosaur bones. And he really opened my eyes to how to actually look at these ancient landscapes through stratigraphy, because that's what it is, right? You're not just looking at rocks for the sake of looking at rocks. What it's really doing is opening a window into deep time, letting you actually envision what the world looked like 50, 60, 70 million years ago. And that's how I got interested in geology. That plus, the classic story of going to Switzerland, picking up rocks, bringing more home than I could even carry with my allotted weight. So I've always kind of had a fascination with, shiny things, but then also through college is when I realized this could actually be a career.
Okay, cool. And I read that you like visited Switzerland and you did kind of dissecting ship lungs with
Oh yeah,
science.
well that was
Yeah,
actually so
sky.
after I graduated,
Okay.
I ended up moving to Colorado following my now wife, then girlfriend, Casey, and I came to Colorado and just tried to find any job I could, and ended up landing at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And like you said, I put on a lab coat and they had me as an exhibit guide, and like you said, I was just dissecting lungs and hearts and setting out little health science experiments for kids and their parents. And that was it was the perfect job getting my introduction just to living in a new city, in a new place. But while I was there, I was also volunteering with the Earth Science Department at the museum, which is actually a really accomplished and huge group of geoscientists and paleontologists. And when I was volunteering with them is when I started being able to go out in the field and actually, uncover dinosaur bones and uh, do all the exciting research of like fossil prep.
Interesting, Patrick. So let's talk about your thesis, like bachelor thesis, master,
Hmm.
and PhD thesis
Closer to what I'm doing
separately,
now. Yeah.
because they encompass a variety of like analysis and research areas. Yeah. So what did you do during your master thesis?
Yeah.
What analysis did you do? And based on your analysis, what conclusions did you draw?
Yeah, great question. So my master's thesis, I started here in 2019 at the Colorado School of Mines, and I really set out to understand a system called the Skullcreekformation, and it was the beginning of my foray into understanding what is called the Western Interior Seaway. And so throughout the Cretaceous, which is about 110 million years all the way to about 65, 66 million years, there was actually a seaway that spanned from north of sort of Alaska, like the Arctic Ocean. It connected, we would be underwater right now. It connected all the way down through Colorado, through parts of New Mexico, into Texas, connected the Gulf and the Arctic. And so it's a really fascinating system because those shorelines ended up being the coastal swamps in which these dinosaurs I was studying previously were walking around in. And the question I went into with my master's thesis was actually, it was the first time that that seaway opened up in Colorado. It's called the Skull Creek Shale. They're a series of marine rocks that are exposed, in parks not too far away from here, Dinosaur Ridge being one of them, that's famous for its footprints and trackways. But I realized that the mudstones there, the Skull Creek Shale, actually had not been studied really at all. I mean, it had maybe one publication on it, despite it being a really important time in the sort of the geography, the landscape evolution of Colorado. And so in the 2 years of my master's, what I set out to do was through cores, through, cored sections underground, I scanned the geochemistry. I scanned them for things like trace elements and geochemical markers that were proxies, right? They were tells of what the bottom of the ocean conditions looked like, whether it was oxic, right? Whether there was conditions for life to thrive with burrows and all sorts of like organic matter being degraded, or whether it was dysoxic or anoxic, and that is not suitable for life. Whether it was very restricted. And what I found is that through those geochemical markers, you can actually put your finger on a point when the seaway went from being a restricted sort of northern embayment and being mostly oxic, right? It was pretty shallow. There were a lot of burrows, to a connected seaway to where it actually connected to the south, and something changed with the ocean circulation. You suddenly started seeing much less oxic waters, but actually enrichment in total organic carbon content.
Okay.
So there were paleoceanographic conditions. Literally it was the connection that let the rocks be much more organic rich, much deeper, and less bioturbated. So that was sort of the master's thesis, was
Cool.
mudstone geochemistry and sedimentology.
Uh-huh. And okay, so the reason why I'm asking this question related to this geochemistry is that I'm a geochemist as well. That's why I would like to know you notice the positive correlation between molybdenum and the TOC,
Yeah.
content of that place formation. So does it tell you anything about the condition of the place? I know TOC or molybdenum content.
Right. Those are the two big geochemical markers that can
Mhm.
tell you. And sometimes in the past, people are using uranium, thorium, vanadium. Unfortunately, those and even sometimes pyrite content. But what I found is that those three proxies were not as clear as molybdenum, and they follow generally the same trends. But molybdenum is really the key geochemical proxy that was linked positively to total organic carbon content, to the preservation of organic matter, and it's inversely correlated with bioturbation. So it's really important to pay attention also to the burrows, because that's another way of telling you, is this ocean bottom suitable for life, right? If it's anoxic, it's not going to be very suitable. You might see a couple little circular planolites. But like you said, it was molybdenum, and the sort of specific that was linked to TOC. And not just that, but the type of organic matter. So specifically the source rock analysis results, TOC is one thing, but if it's type 3, right, if it's sort of woody organic matter, it's going to be more gas prone. It's not as good as of a source rock. what I found is that with those anoxic times, you also have periods of enrichment of type 2, which is the type of
Mhm.
kerogen made by marine microorganisms, little plankton organisms.
Ah, and you use these two instruments, yeah.
Hmm.
So trace elements
Yep.
and the two
And
for.
the SRA, yep. So it was the sort of weapon I used for the geochemistry part was a handheld XRF, sometimes known, the X-ray gun. So I was scanning it every 6 inches, these cores, sometimes, and I scanned 4 cores every 6 inches. So it's probably, got me about 1,200 to 1,300 data points that I could actually see in all of those cores, that marker bed of when it switched from low molybdenum, right? Very oxic settings, high bioturbation, low TOC, and then there was a reversal. High molybdenum, low bioturbation, high TOC. And that was happening when the seaway connected.
Interesting.
Mhm.
So, did you use in your experience other methods apart from trace elements like XRD analysis to
Mhm.
support the data?
Yeah, I didn't personally collect XRD data, and there's so much opportunity for more work to be done on the Skullcreekformation. As I mentioned, it was only really mentioned in one or two pieces of literature, and virtually no trace element geochemistry, even type of data, any dating, any SRA has been done on it. But what I found is that's actually one of the biggest source rocks for the Denver Basin. That's actually it is it yeah, so it feeds a lot of reservoirs in a way that hasn't been known before. And it was kind of unexpected when I saw these TOCs up to like 5-6%, because it was always thought the Skull Creek was sort of a low, sort of not a very mature or high TOC source rock. So
Mhm.
it kind of flew in the face of all those expectations just testing it.
Cool. So you also from those parts which contain high amount of TOC, you could also do biomarker analysis, I
You
would guess.
could, yeah. And in fact, I would encourage anyone to do that. There could be a whole other master's project looking at specifically the yeah, right, the sort of fingerprint of those oils that's producing, looking in the reservoirs and actually testing that hypothesis if these are migrating into those reservoirs. Because all the science pointed towards it being in the proper maturity window and having a high enough TOC where that could, in theory, happen. But yeah, biomarker analysis needs to be done. Even then the stratigraphy work, understanding like regional stratigraphy of those most organic rich intervals would be really important to do. So I mean, that's the nice thing about a master's. It's like you start it, you ask some questions, you answer the ones you can, but it also paves the way for future geoscientists to chart their own course.
So you are now doing your PhD here.
Yes.
So is it correlated, like related to what you did during a master's thesis or not?
Somewhat, only in that it is another system within that vast western interior seaway, right? That I said, spanned 50 million years in the Cretaceous. But what I'm studying now is a sort of a confusing, enigmatic shoreline system that's up in Wyoming. Um, and that I'm instead of studying the source rocks, I'm now studying reservoirs and sort of later Cretaceous reservoirs. And what I noticed is there's sort of this pattern specifically around 90 million years or so, where there are these what are called shelf isolated sand bodies, right? So they are um, sort of lenticular in the subsurface. They generally sort of pinch out in every direction. So there are these almost isolated sands that are excellent targets for oil and gas because they're stratigraphic traps and they're surrounded by great source rocks. But in terms of what system actually left them behind, it's not an easy answer, right? Because are they formed in situ? Are they migrating storm currents that are basically sands on a broad shelf? That's one possibility to create that type of morphology. But the other option is that we know that during this time period, about in the Turonian and the Cretaceous, there are quite a few regional unconformities, and unconformities is just missing rock, right? A lot of systems could form and be subsequently erased in one of those surfaces. So the other question, could these lenticular sort of sandstones that are isolated from their shoreline just be the remnants, right? The erosional remnants of these large unconformable surfaces. And there's reason to believe that at least many of them are. But without doing regional studies and understanding geochronology and stratigraphic frameworks, there's no way to answer that question. And so that's what I'm setting out to do.
Okay, so you have an experience in isotope geochronology as well, eh?
Yes, so uranium lead dating specifically. One of the only ways to sort of solve this problem of when and how did these shelf isolated sand bodies form and how do they correlate is to understand the chronostratigraphic context around them. How old are they relative to each other? And the only way to do that, because you can't just date a quartz sandstone, and sometimes you find fossils like ammonites in them that let you generally constrain that they're within a broad window, usually 2 to 300,000 year windows of those ammonites. But to get the precision you need for things like sequence stratigraphy, for understanding reservoir distribution in a predictive way, you need high precision. By that I mean 10 to 20,000 year, you know, uncertainties, and you can only really get that through uranium lead dating, or apatite of volcanic ash beds.
Okay, so if you're given a rock, so how do you, what kind of techniques would you use to date that one? Maybe there are many ways of taking that, and are they consistent with each other or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of ways that rocks can be dated, and it depends on the question you're trying to answer. But the big ways in sedimentology are, ideally you have, like I mentioned, some sort of volcanic center nearby, because with each eruption, with each, of those ash fall events, there are crystals that actually form either in the magma chamber or in the ash cloud itself, that lock in the age of that eruption. And that's, these are called zircons. And when they first form, they have, mostly they take uranium into their crystal structure. That's how they, and they're very resilient too. Almost diamond hard. Think like cubic zirconium, right? It's not the exact same mineral, but there's a reason people wear them as a substitute for diamonds, because they're really durable. And that makes them great for age dating also, because they survive the processes that deposit sandstones and sometimes mudstones. And so you'll find these crystals that you can and uranium is not stable, right? It decays to lead. And so literally all you're doing is, you're using fancy tools like a mass spectrometer or a laser ablation device, but all you're trying to do is count how much lead there is, which was produced, right, in the known set amount of time from the original parent uranium. So it's a parent-daughter relationship. But literally, it's like you're flipping an hourglass and counting the sand that has dropped down to the bottom. And the ways that we can do that now are so precise that we can get down to, almost, 2 sigma of 0.01% accuracy, which is about 10,000 years for, a 90 million year old rock. But that tells you exactly when that zircon formed in that ash cloud. And so that's the best way, and that's the way that it's expensive to get the really high precision stuff, but the broad low precision where you're just blasting with a laser and reading the gases, it's actually really cheap. You can get a general sense of how old your rocks are through that. You mentioned there's a couple other ways. I mentioned biostratigraphy. That's just using the animals that are found in the rocks and their known evolutionary ranges, right? Animals rise and then go extinct or change forms at sort of known time intervals. Um, and so if you find an ammonite, which are these sort of cephalopod type animals, they look almost like modern nautiloids. They have these nice round shells. They're often used as jewelry. But there are people whose entire lives, they study exactly what shape of their sutures are, and that tells you what type of what subspecies, what genus it is, and that can tell me, okay, I'm in generally this 200,000 year range. And then the other way is through, which I didn't choose to do because it's it's challenging to correlate in areas where it hasn't been done extensively. But for the later Cretaceous, um, is a process called magnetic reversal dating, or it's magnetostratigraphy, where basically we know that the Earth's poles, the magnetic poles, flip and reverse, on a rate of sometimes 1 million to 5 million years, sometimes less, sometimes more. It's pretty unstable in terms of exactly how long these reversals take. But you can actually, if you take in situ samples that are oriented from rocks, the little magnetic elements, like magnetite and other sort of slightly magnetic grains of those rock samples are actually still aligned in the reversal of that ancient time period, 90 million years, what have you. So if you take into account, the sort of shifting of the continent and the modern day position of those rocks, and kind of you can back calculate whether the pole was to the north or to the south. And we know we have a really good constraint throughout the Cretaceous of when those reversals happen, so you can kind of put it in the context that way as well, if you don't have an ash bed or many fossils.
Cool. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I never known about this before.
Look it up, magnetostratigraphy. It's pretty cool, using magnets to date rocks.
Good.
Yeah.
So we can use these three methods for all rocks. For example, sedimentary rocks, metamorphic or igneous rocks?
Yeah, well, these are mostly methods for sedimentary rocks. Igneous and metamorphic rocks. Igneous rocks, you can do magnetic, especially if they're related to like flood basalts or seafloor spreading. You can do the magnetic reversals. In fact, they have, they can. That's how they date rates of seafloor spreading is just by trawling a boat over those basalts that are near these, these sort of ocean spreading ridges, and just you can see it switching north south north south north south, and you can understand the rate of change. But with metamorphic rocks it gets challenging because you're erasing a lot of the original sort of, you're not going to find fossils,
Yeah.
you're not going to see the original orientation of magnetic rain, so that's out. Some and even zircons can get, when they get highly metamorphosed enough, can remelt and recrystallize, and basically your original age is gone. So metamorphic rocks are famously challenging, but what you can sometimes see is, usually the question people have in metamorphic rocks is, you can understand their exhumation history through other minerals, like apatites, or you can actually understand what is the rate at which they came up when they were being uplifted, and that can tell you a little bit more about the age of that terrain.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Amazing. Perfect. So, judging your experience, I think you work in different places.
Yeah.
So, could you tell me about your like uh, work experience? Like you worked in Denver Museum of Science and Nature.
That's where I started. Yeah.
Yeah, we met that place last year. We found that place amazing.
Cool.
So, and also here you work as a teaching assistant.
That's right.
Yeah. So, what functions do you have now?
Yeah. So my summers were generally spent either doing internships. I worked with Chevron last year in their CTC, which is sort of their research lab there. But in terms of what I do during the school year, like you said, I kind of bounce between being a teaching assistant and a research assistant. So mostly I'm on an RA stipend. It's so I'm lucky to be able to support my time here through research, and that's how I get paid, as well as helping my advisor with certain things. But being a TA is just so great. I mean, it's what I love to teach and share this knowledge. And so I've had the pleasure of TAing for a few classes, including uh, my advisor's, undergraduate petroleum geology class, the graduate petroleum geology class, this, and petrology, Marsh's petrology class, which you look at thin sections of rock. Right. You know that about that one this semester. But yeah.
Cool. Patrick, during lab analysis, you teach thin section analysis to students. So, what does it tell you about this environmental condition? So, what specific things do you look at it?
Yeah. No, and it's really important to think about the scale, right? Because what you're looking at is a section of rock only about, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters high, and only, a couple centimeters wide. So when you ask me, what can that tell you about a whole system, out of context, a little bit, but not too much. What's important is to understand the system in which these were taken from. And so they, the fabric of a rock can tell you, a lot about where it came from. For example, if you have in a sedimentary context, if you have a clastic rock section, what type of matrix is there, right? Is it completely porous, right? Is there no mud? Do you see nice rounded like quartz grains? That can tell you that it's aeolian, right? If you have a quartz arenite, rounded grains, even frosted grains sometimes, they'll tell you that came from some sort of likely aeolian system or even sub-environment, versus something that has, more, less mature, so more angular grains, a wider variety of minerals, right? You have to consider the sort of Bowen's reaction series of things that are stable versus unstable at the surface. So if you see things like volcanic minerals or feldspars, those are more likely to break down and turn into clays quicker than something like quartz, right? And so you also consider the mineralogy when you're thinking about the maturity of a sample, and maturity can tell you about transport distance. It tells you,
triangle,
yeah,
feldspars,
exactly, feldspars, quartz versus like lithics or clays. That tells you kind of about how close you are to the terrains these came from.
So you use two methods to determine the maturity of this rocks. Yeah?
Right. Well, there's actually a lot. Yeah, there's maturity. I think there's probably 5 or 6 elements that go into that. It's the matrix, right? It's the sorting, the composition, right? The mineralogy. It's the roundness or angularity. So there's actually quite a few textural trends that you have to understand, like you kind of you have on your checklist before you start thinking about maturity. Yeah.
Mhm. Cool. So you use scene section analysis, and then maybe you might have experience in SEM analysis as well.
That too, yeah. And SEM is when you want to even dive in deeper than a thin section, right? So thin section, so we start out at the outcrop or regional scale, right? You're looking at maybe, 500 meters of rock that you can walk across and see how large bed forms shift. And then you can maybe think about a core, right? A rock core or a well log, where you're seeing maybe just, 3-4 centimeters wide, but still deep, right? You're seeing these changes in broad surfaces. And then you zoom in, you look at a thin section, you see individual textures, maturity, and mineralogy, things like that. And if that isn't enough for you, you put that under, the scanning electron microscope, and that lets you see things like, lets you confirm mineralogy, but more importantly, it lets you look at the actual matrix. So things like where I just said, okay, if the matrix is clay rich, but in reality, understanding the type of clay is really important, whether it's swelling, kaolinite is really important for like drilling strategies. Understanding whether that clay is secondary, right? Like the diagenesis. By that, I just mean what happened to the rock after it was deposited. SEM is really helpful for, because you might see things like on a feldspar where in thin section, you're like, well, it looks like it's partially dissolved. But on the SEM, it'll actually let you see exactly what that's altering into. And so that can create secondary porosity networks. And so sometimes these SEM results can make or break a reservoir because they let you understand where your porosity is being created.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also use SEM, scene section, and X-ray analysis for my outcrop samples derived from Guadalupe and Sacramento Mountains.
And those are carbonates, right?
Yes, carbonates. Yeah. So I got amazing, interesting results. Patrick, so you have experience in analysis of outcrops and core analysis.
That's right. Yeah.
So is there any differences between those two analysis? Are they the same? Do we need to use the same approach for those two things to get the same conclusion, or are they different?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because one of my chapters is actually kind of devoted to this core to outcrop stratigraphy question, right? The scale at which you're seeing these systems is really different, but in many cases, all you have is cores. A lot of entire sedimentary systems, right? Depositional environments never outcrop. You only see them in, driller's core. And so it's really important to understand what you can and can't do with core, right? The limits, but also the benefits. The benefits, I would say, are the ability to see the finer sort of lamina scale sedimentary structures and mudstone, specifically any mud-rich sandstone or muddy sandstone or even mudstone. In outcrop, it's going to be a vegetated hill slope. You might be able to dig a trench through it, with a lot of field assistance and labor, but you're never going to see the level of detail that you see in core in mudstones. It's just you have plants growing all over it, right? But so that's, it's really important, especially when you're looking at things like parasequences and cycles of sort of coarsening upward, where things turn from mostly clay rich to maybe a little bit silty and then back to mud rich again, right? That cycle is really important to understand because it might correlate to a full sandstone bench further west or east or wherever your source is. But what core can't tell you is things like, lateral heterogeneity. Like usually only one core is taken in like a producing field, and the next core is maybe 20 kilometers away or 50 kilometers away. So that it's just one snapshot into a system, and you might have a 10-meter thick sand package, but who's to say that if you don't understand the system where that came from, that could be a single channel that is not present anywhere else in the field, or it could be a long shoreline like a strand plane. And in many cases, you need to look at closely at the sedimentary structures, which in core are not as easy to distinguish, because you might see something like low angle bedding. Now, cores can be taken at angles where the dip of the structural dip makes everything appear to be cross stratified, but in reality, you're actually just seeing the dip of the core barrel, and you have all sorts of complications with understanding sedimentary structures in core. In the outcrop, you can be absolutely sure with regional measurements that what you're measuring is actually like a paleo flow. You're understanding the geometry of bed forms, things like we have a sort of, let's say, a tide-dominated sort of dune that's been migrating. You can see moving across reactivation surfaces across your outcrop belt, and you can actually go and measure it and say, well, on average, these things are, I don't know, 80 meters long, and then they sort of pinch out. That's something you'll never understand from core, and it lets you understand, once you're actually drilling this thing, reservoir heterogeneity, but also things like depositional environment. Right? I don't know from core whether the sand was deposited necessarily in a shoreline or a delta, but with outcrop work, you can really piece that together.
Okay, interesting. But the outcrop sample might be weathered.
It could be weathered, yeah.
But the core sample is intact. So
exactly. So things like the smaller scale features and burrows too, right? Bioturbation is really important. It's another sort of focus of my chapters. The animals that are living in these shorelines are telling you about the conditions in which these sands are being deposited. So, and if you go to like a modern delta, right, the delta front is a place of where you have your river that's just pouring mud and sand, and it's a very hard environment for animals to live, right? So you're going to see a lot of opportunistic feeders after these sort of river outwash events. So you're going to have very limited, and it's also saline water, so they don't like that. As opposed to think about like an open kind of East Coast beach on a stable platform, you have clams that are burrowing 4 or 5 up to a meter into the substrate, and we can see those same behaviors, right? Ichnology is about behavior, not about organisms. You can see those same like life behaviors in the sedimentary record, and cores are some of the best places to see that, because like you said, in outcrop everything might be weathered and it looks kind of just modeled, right? And you need to see core to actually understand, yes, that's an individual organism behaving this way, which tells you, it's a probably some sort of delta or a shoreline, something like that.
The next question is about this. Well, so you are now currently working here, and what plans do you have for your future? So as you finish your PhD, would you like to move to another city, or would you like to keep working here?
Yeah, well, I'd love to stay in Colorado. That's a great question. I mean, thinking about the future is important. I've been a student for a long time. I'm definitely ready to start applying these skills beyond just internships. But in terms of what I want to do, the reason I went for a PhD and I didn't just stop at a master's is I kind of had the sobering realization that to really do what I loved, I need to produce, right? I need to make research happen. And generally, you need a PhD to have a position where you can do that. So whether that's in a lab like at the United States Geological Survey, they have a lot of research labs that do great work in terms of like assessments of resources, but also emerging geothermal prospects and sort of carbon capture. And they need reservoir specialists and paleoenvironmental specialists for that, geochemists. Also, I got my start at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. There's a select number of positions to be like a curator or even do a postdoc there. I'm thinking forward to that, about whether there's a role that I could play and support their earth sciences team, because they're such a great group to work with, and I would love to sort of see what the future looks like for geology at the museum.
Good.
And then like here at Mines, I teaching this petrology class and helping run the labs was just so fulfilling for me. So looking to see if there's an opportunity to either do a postdoc that could lead into like a temporary or even eventually a professorship somewhere. But staying in Colorado, I think, is a priority. My wife and I have a house in the sort of a condo in the mountains right now, and not looking to move anytime soon.
Okay, cool. So, thank you very much, Patrick, for your interview.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, good luck with the dissertation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.